Welcome, bienvenidas to the next public lecture, I think number 4 for our series Diversity Medialities, organized as cooperation between the Ibero-American Institute in Berlin and Mecila. I'm Clara Ruvituso. I am postdoc researcher in Mecila at the Ibero-American Institute, and I will moderate the session today and also introduce our guest, Juliana Streva. Juliana is a transdisciplinary researcher interested in the conversation of critical legal studies, social sciences, philosophy, and arts. Currently, she is a postdoctoral fellow at the Freie Universität Berlin, part of the project Global Repertoires of Living Together by Berlin University Alliance. Her work engages with anti-colonial, anti-racist, and feminist epistemologies and praxis, particularly focusing on questions of knowledge production, corporality, subjectivity, and fugitive strategies of re-existence and coexistence. I will only mention some recent publications, including the contribution to the book Gramática das Corporeidades Afrodiaspóricas, and Materializing Feminism, also the publication of the book Corpo, Raza, Poder, and the making of the documentary film Mujeres en Movimiento. Juliana was also a junior fellow in Mecila, a colleague, and I am very glad to continue our conversation on knowledge, circulation of knowledge, and thank you for accepting the invitation. Juliana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Clara. I thank you for the invitation and for the introduction. I will start sharing my presentation. So thank you very much for organizing this event, and so we can keep also the conversation that we previously started at Mecila. As Clara already introduced me, I'm Juliana, and I'm going to be speaking today a bit of ongoing project research and thinking. So I think it's a bit of a collective thinking that we have the chance here to engage with. So I will call this lecture as a sharing lecture. So it's not a very traditional type of lecture. And this name of sharing lecture is much inspired in the most recent book of Catherine McKittrick, Dear Science and Other Stories. And there she conceptualized sharing as a way of collaborating and collaborative forms of producing knowledge. So instead of the ownership of knowledge, to see knowledge as a collective process. And within this concept of sharing, I also situate my lecture here as not only my lecture, but as a collective ongoing legacy of anti-colonial feminist from Brazil, but also elsewhere. So here I also mention this difference of that Paulo Freire mentioned of banking education and process of inquiry. So here I think my attempt in this sharing lecture is trying to be maybe less classic pedagogic and more instigating. So to produce a dialogue afterwards, instead of thinking that I have the knowledge and the audience have no knowledge and I'm transferring my knowledge. So it's much more a conversation, but because of the frame to record the lecture, we're gonna have first my presentation and then I hope a conversation. So I will start with this PowerPoint to show some of the books that are the base of this conversation. The conversation is not only based on them, but mostly based on them. Those are the most recent publications of Lélia Gonzalez and Beatriz Nascimento in Brazil. They are compilations of their work because they haven't published an author book in their living works. So this came afterwards as compiling interviews, papers, magazine writings, conversations in conferences. So the first one from Lélia Gonzalez have been was organized by Flávia Rios and Márcia Lima, published last year. And the on my right side, Beatriz Nascimento, was also published last year, organized by Alex Hatz. And these are also two books. I have them here. They are beautiful, but I will not even be like showing because it's hard to find them here. And they haven't been translated, as most of anti-colonial thinkers from Brazil, they haven't been translated to English. Those are two books also recently published by Leda Maria Martins. Afrografias is not recent, but was recently reprinted. But her most recent book is the right one, Performances no Tempo Espiralar, and they also will move the conversation today. And the thing of not being translated is also part of the circulation of knowledge that Clara also engages deeply in her work, and which type of work have been translated to English and circulated beyond the geographies where they are produced, and the ones that have not. So also it's important to bring these works in English, in this lecture in English, for sharing them. So in the second part of the title, I mentioned anti-colonial feminisms, and I will briefly explain that. Anti-colonial, I think I'm not using here decolonial, post-colonial, or other types of other fashion terminologies, because the authors that I've been working on, they didn't name themselves as decolonial or post-colonial. They are previous to those terminologies. Also subaltern theories, they all came afterwards. They are previous to them, and still they struggle against colonialism. So anti-colonial has been the name used for the struggle, the political struggle, and also for the academic struggle that I've been preferring this way, naming them as anti-colonial thinkers instead of decolonial or post-colonial thinkers. And here I quote Lélia Gonzalez on her struggle against colonialism and also the construction of another self-identity. And here she's in a dialogue with other thinkers from the Caribbean and from Latin America, such as Frantz Fanon and Aimé Césaire. So she also engaged with their works. And the second quote, precisely because both sexism and racism start from biological differences to establish themselves as ideologies of domination. Therefore, the questions arises, how can we explain this forgetfulness on the part of feminism? The answer, in our opinion, lies in what some social scientists characterize as racism by omission, and whose roots, we say, lie in an Eurocentric and neo-colonialist worldview. So they, Lélia Gonzalez, and I would also say Beatriz Nascimento, even though I'm not quoting her here, they are engaging with the interconnection and entanglement of the struggle against racism, the feminist struggle, and the anti-colonial struggle. And feminism, because even though Beatriz Nascimento doesn't name herself directly as a feminist, Lélia Gonzalez did name herself. After all, I am a feminist. She quoted in 1988. And Beatriz Nascimento has been much engaged in researching Quilombo within women leaderships and the woman role in Quilombo, so women's movement, since she was writing in the 70s, and in that period, feminism was led by white middle-class women, as Lélia Gonzalez described here in 1979. And feminism was also related to this denial of racism, the silence with regard to racial discrimination. So this is the entanglement that I'm bringing, anti-colonial feminism, and bringing those writers that we're gonna relate today with this category. This lecture, this sharing lecture, will also involve some videos. So I hope that you bear with me with the videos also. The videos are part of a broader project that I did, a film documentary. So they are short parts, conversations within this film documentary that Clara mentioned in my introduction, named Mulheres em Movimento, Women in Movement. So this is also a process of listening to their story lives and their struggles in learning with. So we start with Michelle Andrews. The film is also available online, so you can later watch it. So I mentioned in the title, this body as knowledge, body as Quilombo, influenced by this quote from Beatriz Nascimento, each individual is the power, each individual is the Quilombo, to bring from this quote some notions of Quilombo to think the very production of knowledge and how academic researchers, thinkers have been produced knowledge, and how this also relates to not only something detached from powers, from territory, from memory, from oral history, and from existence. So we're going to try to see those entanglements in some precise points in this presentation. So the bigger quote from Beatriz Nascimento is this one that I translated. Quilombo research is based on and starts from the question of power. No matter how much a social system dominates, it is possible that a differential system is created within it, and that is what the Quilombo is. But it is not a state of power in the sense that we understand it, political power, power of domination, because it doesn't have this perspective. Each individual is the power, each individual is the Quilombo. So here, since I know that maybe some of you are not familiarized with the notion of Quilombo, I will bring just a brief explanation of the historical Quilombo. For more than 4 centuries, the communities formed by such runaways slaves, dotted the fringe of plantation in the America, from Brazil to the southwest United States, from Peru to the American Southwest. Known varies as palenques, quilombos, mocambos, cumbas, ladeiras, mambizes, maroons. These new societies ranged from tiny bands that survived less than a year to powerful states encompassing thousands of members and surviving for generations or even centuries, as it was the case of Zumbi dos Palmares, the longest and largest quilombo in the continent that endures almost a century in Brazil. But what we are referring here as Quilombo is not only this historical Quilombo. So the historical Quilombo that Richard Price mentioned is this resistance that happened during slavery colonial plantation system, where enslaved Black persons escaped from this plantation system and created alternative communities to resist colonialism and slavery. And these communities were also formed by Indigenous persons and also some white persons. So this involved the flight from this colonial violence system to create alternative ways of existence and coexistence. And such a strategy of reinventing ways of living together, as Price mentioned, has received much less attention than the violence resistance or even some revolts, rebellions carried out by enslaved persons during slavery and colonial times. And Marronage and Quilombo has been only recent brought attention by researchers, academics, but not by the Black movement, the Black Unified movement. And one of the reasons that Richard Price gives this is the absence of data in English. And again, this is a point of the politics of translation. But now, bringing this notion, this historical notion to Quilombo, to the presentation, to the dialogue today, the notion of Quilombo here, as Beatriz Nascimento works with, is much beyond this historical movement. This is also this historical movement, but something that is continual, something that didn't stop with the end of slavery, didn't stop with the end of the formal colonial regime. It's a movement that has continued in different strategies of resistance and coexistence until today, that reinvent ways of knowing, ways of living, ways of being, ways of surviving together. And in this theoretical framework, the notion of escape and fugitivity that commonly has been associated with something that you don't want to face, so you escape a problem, something that you want to run away without changing, the notion of escape and fugitivity has a completely different dimension, is actually the result of a process of reorganization and contestation of established order. So here, Beatriz Nascimento mentions that Quilombos, she's not dealing with this notion and this practice as idealized view, but as something that has a history and has also a practice still today. So here, this part of the time space of Quilombo, that is also this physical space of a community that is resisting, but is beyond a territorial space. It's also a symbolic space of resistance. I'm giving this introduction to actually bring how we are going to see this Quilombo as the body and how we're going to entangle this with this anti-colonial feminism as a way of to think ways of knowing and to think practices of resistance. So here again, the quote, each individual is the power, each individual is the Quilombo, that I previously read. So we can see that the notion of Quilombo has a multi-sided territorialization. It's an attitude, is a social settlement, is an anti-colonial movement that is not only a reaction, that means that is not only a rebellion, an insurrection, a war, but is also a positive and creative way of living, what Beatriz Nascimento names as paz quilombola, peace quilombola. So it goes beyond a geographic, a demography, an economic and cultural organization. It's also a feeling of the ocean in a more poetic way. It's a way of articulating resistance, assemblage. It's a verb. You can also say to aquilombar. It's an action, it's a practice. And it's also the body and embodiment. And other meanings, this is some examples that I could bring here from the work of Beatriz Nascimento. So bringing this notion of Quilombo to the talk today means to disrupt these places, disrupt territorialities, to understand the dynamics of space, rather than a static political institution located in the past. The notion of that Beatriz Nascimento proposed of Quilombo moves away from understanding of territoriality as fixed towards a framing of territoriality as becoming. Quilombo as an embodied practice of refuge and retreat. And here I put in this kind of divided aesthetics on purpose, because this goes beyond the binary way of seeing the world, as such as Frantz Fanon names as zones of being and zones of non-being, this kind of dualistic, opposed way of seeing. So this sense of space and place that moves away from what we have been understood or learned to see a cartography, a map, a category, to give someone a place, to give someone an identity from outside. This means already a fixed, a rigidity. And here I quote Lélia Gonzalez. In our opinion, the person who best summed up this type of racial domination was a Brazilian humorist when he said, in Brazil, there is no racism because the Black person knows her or his place. This is already a essentialized way of existence, that there is no possible way of moving beyond that. There's only a place to be. Here I quote Catherine McKittrick. In terms of geography, our sense of place, our here is a Black person's, Black woman's sense of place, is often preconceptualized as dead and dying. And this lifelessness extends outward from the death and deadness towards extinction. The dead spaces are inextricably linked to dehumanizing scripts. They require one another. One cannot have the welfare queen without the objectionable infrastructures that surround her. So finally, I bring these notions that I mentioned at the beginning that this lecture will gonna be less pedagogic and more a process of inquiring. So I'm bringing many lies and thoughts, and maybe we can discuss this better also in the second part of the lecture. But I'm bringing this now to this feeling of place, this feeling of space and territory, to think the spaces of speaking, the spaces that many people, marginalized people, has been spoken for in academia, in knowledge production. To the extent that racism as a discourse is situated among the discourse of exclusion, the group excluded by it is treated as an object and not as a subject. Consequently, it is infantilized, has no right to its own voice, it's spoken for. Now with Beatriz Nascimento. Dedicating myself once again to academic work, I have felt trapped by the literary form necessary for this ritualization of knowledge. It has meant overturning my own mode of expression. It has provoked a physical repulsion to the written world. And here I bring to, since it's a sharing lecture, to sharing of songs. So this is the name of the music and the name of the musicians that deals with this. So it's also a process of listening, not only reading written words. So Ricon Sapiense, Ponto de Lança, and Prophet Shep's Agenda 1, Damu de Fat Monk, Archie Chap, Raw Poetic. So we're gonna skip the video, but later I will show the link where you can watch the videos. And it's the process of silencing, the difficulty of listening. So what I just mentioned with the quote of Lélia Gonzalez and Beatriz Nascimento results in this process of silencing in the academic realm, in which the Western method of investigation produces and reproduces a colonial extractivist logic in which marginalized persons are still perceived as objects of study, as a data, as a number, as a scientific passive source, as a non-human, instead of what they actually are, human beings, subjects of knowledge. But day after day, Black, Indigenous, travestis, lesbian, bisexual, favelada women have been breaching this ecocidal and genocidal logic to make their voices, narratives, stories, agendas, theories, lived experiences, cosmologies, and desires heard. Therefore, peripheric narratives should not be equated with the absence of speaking, but rather with the absence of listening. The claim here in this sharing lecture is not to give anyone voice. The gesture is towards a politics and a poetics of listening that enables dialogues and dismantle the historic monologue. And such a historical monologue has been named as epistemicide, coloniality of knowledge, political economy of knowledge production, internal colonialism, white innocence, cognitive plantation, political economy of academic and non-academic disciplinary thinking, epistemic violence. These are some of the terminologies used to refer of the problem that I'm pointing here as politics of silence. That is the way of not listening, narrative stories, claims that have been evoked historically by especially marginalized people, but especially Black, Indigenous, trans, travesti, lesbian, bisexual, favelada woman. So what I'm bringing to this lecture is that we usually perceive this structural institutional violence that we live, racial capitalism, colonial plantation, the afterlives of colonial plantation that has been masked or renamed or updated in a liberal constitutional democracy without actually confronting the legacies that it was produced on, the base of modernity. Bringing this structural violence to think academic violence. That is how researchers, investigators, academia, universities operate, producing and reproducing knowledge that often reproduce this extractivist logic, the silencing, the epistemicide, the absence of translation, the objectification of the others as an object of research, case studies, infantilization. And here, connecting the lines, the action of speaking that I've been mentioned, not by accident, has been often used with references to geographies, to space, to territory, positionality, standpoint theory, lugar de fala, which is locus of enunciation, or speaking nearby. The action of speaking has been a key concern addressed by critical race, feminist, and anti-colonial frameworks. They emphasize the importance of recognizing one's position within the existing structure of power when researching, writing, speaking, acting. Instead of abstract, disembodied, metaphysic beings, we are, not surprisingly, situated, embodied, historical, and flesh subjects. Within the institutional sphere, the process of othering and silencing attempts to reduce the non-hegemonic and the insurgent narratives to undetectable, indistinguishable, senseless, particular, isolated sounds. At the same time, white male speakers have been provided the necessary counterpart of listening public by the state institution and institutional politics. Such a structural set produces the myth that only they have a voice and therefore they would speak for everyone. And to this, Lélia Gonzalez names the abstract universal rationalism typical of a masculinized and white discourse. Women's movement, the Black and Indigenous women, are the living testimony of this exclusion. So the attempt of listening to the body, not only to the written or the requoted works, it's also an attempt to disrupt this type of legacy, of colonial legacy, of the way we perceive knowledge and reproduce knowledge. I'm going to skip here because of the time. So here, I go to the footnote 33 of the book of Audre Lorde, System Outsider, Essays and Speeches, that I think connect what this lecture, this sharing lecture is about. And where the words of women are crying to be heard, we must each other of us recognize our responsibility to seek those words out, to read them and share them and examine them in their pertinence to our lives, that we not hide behind the mockeries of separations that have been imposed upon us and which so often we accept as our own. For instance, I can't possibly teach Black women's writing, their experience is so different from mine. Yet, how many years have you spent teaching Plato and Shakespeare and Proust? And all the other endless ways we rob ourselves of ourselves and each other. So the point here of bringing this anti-colonial feminists to think about the body and other ways of knowledge, or other ways of knowing, other ways of producing and reproducing knowledge, is not a separatist movement, but is a way of creating an assemblage of ways of knowing, is to disrupt a monologue that has been one exclusive way of seeing science and ways of knowing, and to open to other ways of listening, knowing, experiencing knowledge. And this has been a claim historical claim by Black Indigenous women from Brazil and from elsewhere. And here I'm bringing this claim to the work of Beatriz Nascimento, especially Lélia Gonzalez for now, but we're going to soon see also Leda Maria Martins. So what I'm claiming here with these main three authors is the poetic and politics of listening. Is to see the lived experience not opposed to scientific knowledge, but to see knowing as feeling as knowing, an onto-epistemology. This necessarily challenges the binary and hierarchized way of thinking, bringing attention to the relationality and the entanglements, and not the opposition between theory and practice, writing and orality, language and dance, knowledge and experience, etymology and movement. In this way, the primacy of the written language above other ways of knowing and sharing is displaced and challenged. And here another suggestion in the PowerPoint, Carolina Maria de Jesus. This was translated to German, English, Spanish, and many languages, her book, Parto de Despejo. So finally, we arrive to what I'm calling as epistemology of the body. And this epistemology of the body has been also very much addressed by Beatriz Nascimento when she writes, "Body map of a distant country that seeks other borders that limit the conquest of me. Memory is the content of a continent, of its life, its history and its past. And if the body were, as if the body were the document, was the document, sorry, here's the mistake of my translation. It is no wonder that dance for the Black man is a moment of liberation. The Black man cannot be liberated until he forgets his captivity, does not forget in his gesture that he is no longer a captive." So in her work, very poetic work, she was Beatriz Nascimento, a historian, an activist, a poet, also collaborating in a film, Ori, with Raquel Gerber. She addresses the body as a map, as a document, as history, as memory, as also a way of knowing and understanding the world. So she also brings the history not only as this binary way of seeing the history, in which there is the history of the victor and the defeated, but she claims that we have not yet been defeated, and that individuals are full of stories, and here histories. Their stories may be small, but they are rich and captivating. So what she's proposing as a task as an academic, but also as an activist, and also as a poet, is not merely to exist, but to make life more beautiful and happier in her work through other ways of existing and knowing. And finally, I bring the conversation to the work of Leda Maria Martins that directly connects with what I previously mentioned of Lélia Gonzalez and Maria Beatriz Nascimento. Leda Maria Martins, it was a long time ago, so I'm going to show again her books. So these are the two books that I've been working on, Afrografias da Memória e Performances do Tempo Espiralar. She conceptualizes the notion of oralitura. In the Bantu and Agô Yoruba traditions and diasporic praxis, the body is not only the extension of a represented knowledge, nor the archive of a statistic crystallization. The body is rather the site of a knowledge in continuous movement of a formal recreation, reference, and perennial transformations of the cultural corpus. The body in performance is a place of inscription of knowledge, knowledge that is written in the gesture, in the movement, in the choreography, in the solfege of vocality, as well as in the props that performatively covered. And this entanglement between body, time, performance, space, memory, and knowledge has been named by radical Black thinkers as encruzilhada in Brazil, which is a term that also comes from Afro-Brazilian religious and traditions. So it's a way of seeing the entanglement of those experiences that comes from written, oral, body, movement, knowledge, dance, music, video. That's why also I decided to bring to this presentation some of the voices of women that I spoke with in my field work that I did during my doctorate study, that their knowledge is also important to be listened, and it's part of this process of learning and understanding what anti-colonial feminism would be. It's not possible to only find this in books in the libraries, because some women are writing books, others are not writing books, are activists, are on the ground, are experiencing other ways that it's also knowledge. It should not be dismissed as knowledge. So this type of framing the body as a place of resistance, as a place of knowledge, as a quilombo, as a way of thinking other ways of living together, as a way of challenge colonial structures of power, brings here a process of inquiry, what Edouard Glissant names a science of inquiry instead of a science of conquest, to rethink traditional epistemologies and methodologies, to rethink academic research and knowledge production, to rethink ways of linear temporality, to rethink hegemonic space, geography, cartography, and mappings, to rethink language as a live process, in living process, to rethink psychoanalysis as not only an individual issue, but as a collective, sociogenic question, to rethink lists, numbers, statistics, categories, dictionaries, catalogs, the way identity has been presented to us, subjectivity, personhood, Anthropocene, to rethink representation and the very way politics has been institutionalized. And here is a mention of Quilombismo, which is a project created by Leda Maria Martins that I previously mentioned, oralitura, the concept of oralitura, that also promotes other ways of knowledge, such as theater and visual arts. So she created this project and award to fund kind of counter narratives projects that also involves visualities and acting. So with this, I finished this sharing lecture to open for a dialogue. And here, as I promised during the entire lecture over and over, it's the link where you can find the entire film and also the project, because the film is part of this project, Mulheres em Movimento, the film. And it is also, this lecture is kind of entangled and part of this video essay that was published this year, We Will Not Be Interrupted, The Poetics of Listening and Struggling Together, published last month. So thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juliana, for your sharing lecture. I really like to hear you always with this form of challenging, actually, the form we know the academia, the form we know the knowledge production, and even in the decolonial and post-colonial mode, that is also very important in Europe now and also in the North. And I think we don't know these authors or these persons. And I think it's amazing when you put these quotes from the 70s, the 80s, 90s. I mean, really parallel as works that said some things that in the 90s was said for post-colonial and decolonial, was put in the word, and the production of knowledge in these spaces was incredible, but really don't circulate. And I think your work is very important to circulate these knowledges also here in Berlin. And I'm very grateful for this work, to circulate this this knowledge, but this is also, I think, a challenge what you put for all the people in academia to think, okay, there are a problem with the form we are producing knowledge also. And I think it's a very provocative but very important question you open. I have always a question about the problem of circulation of knowledge, because you mentioned at the beginning they are not translated, but now there are maybe I have a bias, but I have the feeling that they are circulating now. And I was always asking me why they are discovered now. Beatriz Nascimento, Lélia, Gonzalez, they are both not living now, I think. They are both dead. But there are now, in the last 5 years, there are a new circulation of these authors. Why? What happened? And maybe you can explain this discovery. I don't like this word, but maybe you can explain something about why we are speaking about this woman now.
Yes, thank you for the question, Clara. I think it's important to also contextualize them because the books that I was introducing at the beginning of the lecture, they are quite recent. They were published 1 year ago, and most of them is from last year or 2 years ago. And I would say that when I start reading them, of course, there is always this attempt to bring this archive, because when Beatriz Nascimento was murdered, all the papers she produced was just delivered from her daughter to the National Archive. So it was stay there, and only researchers would go there and have access to this material. And was also an effort of researchers to bring this material from the archive to the book, because there is also a different way of circulation of knowledge when it's printed into a book form. But I would say that the time frame of the last 5 years, there is a boom in the Brazilian publisher houses, especially regarding Black radical thinkers, indigenous thinkers, and feminist thinkers, because the political context of the previous 10 years, that because of the national insertion of indigenous and Black students into the university sphere, because of the national politics of Lula and Dilma, created huge difference in how the debate was held in the classes, right? How the syllabus of a seminar were going to be disputed and questioned. And before that was predominantly only white students and white professors. And this scenario completely changed after racial quotas in Brazil. And I think this also has a positive result in the publishing houses to recover those legacies, these thinkers that have been or sold out and you cannot find the book. I remember when I was researching Lélia Gonzalez, and there was a book that she wrote with Carlos Hasenbaud that's called O Lugar do Negro, the place of the Black. And I could not find the book in Brazil, and I could only find when I was a visiting fellow in the United States in the library there, I could find the print of the book, and I have to digitalize the book and send back in 2015. And now you can find that all these books have been reprinted. Frantz Fanon was also sold out in the moment, and now it's just every bookstore you go, you're going to find a copy of Frantz Fanon, Lélia Gonzalez, Beatriz Nascimento. So I think it's a result of this articulation of the Black movement within the universities, and also the students' collectives. They are very active in reclaiming the professors, the names, the legacies, the knowledge that have been dismissed historically in Brazil. But thank you for the question. It's good to explain this, since I didn't mention